If you've played Dark Souls, you've definitely heard the phrase, prepare to die, and also, you died. Hi, I'm Jacob with the Leaderboard, and today we're going to cover the two most recent entries into this infamously tough series. This is Then vs. Now, Dark Souls 2 vs. Dark Souls 3. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to become part of our notification squad. So what is Dark Souls anyway? Dark Souls was developed by From Software, the company behind the Armored Core series, the Tenchu series, and a game that lets you play as the President of the United States in a giant mech. The Dark Souls series is exactly what the name claims. It's dark. The story, the characters, the general tone, even the locations themselves are dark. Haha, very funny. Can someone turn on the lights? I can't see anything. Great, thanks. The games also feature heavy gothic influences to really underscore that sad, depressing tone. They fall under the action RPG genre, which basically means that you whack monsters with a sword until they die. But unlike other action RPG games, Dark Souls prides itself in having a complex combat system that asks you to do a whole lot more than whack at monsters until they die. Players can create characters based on their preferred playstyles. Want to play as a modded out Sonic the Hedgehog that rolls everywhere? You can do that. Want to create a character that focuses on big swords and heavy armor? You're covered. Want a solid build that lets you try different types of weapons? You got it. Want to dual wield shields and become an unstoppable force? You get the picture. Dark Souls offers players many ways to play the game, which in turn gives players plenty of reasons to replay the game with different builds. The combat is very grounded in these differing playstyles. For example, if I were to go up against someone in player versus player combat, I'd have a lot of factors to consider beyond just predicting their movements. I'd have to think about what kind of weapon I would use, as weapon sizes and types determine the damage. I'd have to think about whether my weapon can break through shields. I'd have to think about range, if it can knock an opponent down, and how much downtime it requires between attacks. This combat mechanic, while complex, has earned Dark Souls many adoring fans. The backstory. You might be thinking, well, there can't be that much of a difference between Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, right? Well, believe it or not, there is. In order to properly compare Dark Souls 2 and 3, we have to explore the history of the games that came before. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. Demon's Souls was a project by From Software that was created as a spiritual successor to the Kingsfield series. The Kingsfield series was almost scrapped until Hidetaka Miyazaki decided to direct the game. Miyazaki was able to refocus the game and eventually complete it. It was released exclusively for the PlayStation 3, where it received abundant praise for its unique multiplayer mechanics, its incorporation of death into the core gameplay, its intensive combat, and of course, its punishing gameplay. These features would become defining characteristics for what we now consider the Soulsborne genre. While Demon's Souls did enjoy relative success, it wasn't until its successor series, Dark Souls, that From Software got the spotlight. Dark Souls was a massive hit with gamers and critics alike. Multiple news outlets called it the greatest game of its generation. Edge magazine even went as far as calling it the greatest game of all time. Dark Souls 2 was released on March 11th, 2014 for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. It was released to positive reviews by critics, but unlike the original, Dark Souls 2 wasn't universally loved by fans. While many fans didn't hate it, they felt that it didn't live up to the original, though from a technical perspective, the game was better in virtually every way, with shiny new graphics, a better PvP system, and more combat variation. And it was a lot easier for new players to pick up than the original. Dark Souls 2's release. Dark Souls 2 got a lot of criticism when it came out. It quickly became the black sheep of the series, with fans continuing to debate how it holds up against its siblings, especially Dark Souls 3. Some players felt like the game increased its difficulty in an irresponsible way. It required a much steeper learning curve than the original. For example, the game would throw many groups of enemies at the player to deal with at once, rather than having the player engage in one-on-one combat before taking on a horde. And there were also a lot of small changes that really added up. Players were surprised to find that the game looked a little bit worse than what they'd seen in the trailers, especially when it came to the lighting. While it was still better looking than Dark Souls 1, the game was more washed out than it looked in its trailers. Sources close to the dev team noted that the game had to sacrifice the lighting in favor of a playable frame rate, and any Souls fan knows how important that is. The game did have better cloth physics though, which counts for a lot in a game that's full of death shrouds and creepy capes. When all was said and done, veteran players felt like the game didn't have the cohesive vision of the original. The game's plot was also different. We won't get too deep into spoilers, but rest assured that the game has the same grim and depressing theme as the others. Miyazaki, who had directed Demon's Souls and Dark Souls' sister series, Bloodborne, did not direct Dark Souls 2. Instead, he took on a supervisory role. It wasn't until Dark Souls 3 that Miyazaki would return to the world of Dark Souls, trying again with Scholar of the First Sin. In between the release of Dark Souls 2 and 3, From Software re-released Dark Souls 2 as Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, for the same systems, but also next-gen systems as well. There really isn't a whole lot to say about this version, except that it has a lot of neat improvements to the game. These updates gave new players a reason to pick it up. It also changed a lot of enemy placements, giving returning players a reason to rage quit all over again. Oh boy, here comes Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 was released on April 12th, 2016 for Xbox One, PS4, and PC, and like every other Souls game made by From Software, it was received well by critics. However, fans were still divided. With Miyazaki returning, the series was much more focused, though some fans felt that this focus resulted in a more linear game, with the player always having a general sense of where the next area was. The game took full advantage of being on next-gen consoles, and as a result, the environments were the best they've ever looked. However, like Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3 had graphic issues when it was initially launched. Whereas Dark Souls 2 downgraded its graphics to compensate for its frame rate, Dark Souls 3 did not. While PC had relatively no problems running at a silky smooth 60 FPS, PS4 on the other hand ran at 30 FPS with the rare drop in frame rate, but Xbox users really got the short end of the stick. On Xbox, the game's resolution wasn't at a full 1080p, but rather 900p, and despite that low resolution, the game still suffered occasional frame rate drops, and those ever-improving cloth physics couldn't compensate for the fans' disappointment. Fans felt that though the game was more successful than Dark Souls 2, it still took a few steps back, mainly in the deeper mechanics of combat. There was a much larger focus on the PvP, with one of the DLCs unlocking a PvP area. One major difference in Dark Souls 3 is that after the success of Bloodborne, Miyazaki wanted to implement the elements of Bloodborne into Dark Souls 3, which resulted in a much faster game. No, seriously, while it might not look like a drastic change, the change in speed gives players just enough time to get in one more hit, or to dodge an attack and survive on a sliver of health. PvP. Another big change is how player versus player works. Players can invite other players into their games or get invaded by hostile players. Many hardcore fans of the series dedicated themselves to playing PvP. If you open another tab on YouTube right now and search Dark Souls PvP, you'll find thousands of videos of people playing the PvP. When invading another player's game in Dark Souls 3, the game prioritizes servers that have other players summoned into the game, which effectively means that rather than battling it out one-on-one, invading players often found themselves fighting 2 or more opponents. Many fans of the series took issue with this. They felt like the system was discouraging invading, as it was often a death sentence for invaders. Despite its less popular changes, Dark Souls 3 still got plenty of love. Dark Souls 3 became the easiest way to get into this difficult game series. The gameplay itself wasn't any easier, but developers had streamlined some of the game's more challenging aspects, like the leveling up system. It also made the menus easier to navigate and understand. Dark Souls 3 took from its predecessors not only by bringing back gameplay mechanics from Demon Souls, but also by referencing the previous 2 Dark Souls games. Players run into characters from the original game and revisit places from the first 2 games. Dark Souls 3 leans heavily on these references to build its story, and the story is where the game gets really complicated. So, what's the story? Just to give you an idea of how complicated the story is, Namco, the publishers of Dark Souls, held a contest before the release of Dark Souls 3 that offered fans $10,000 to make a video that explained the story of the Dark Souls series. Dark Souls' plot is buried deep within the game, and it is a massive story. The player can't rely on talking to NPCs or watching cutscenes to uncover the story either. They have to learn about it through item descriptions and through context clues in their surroundings. But the problem with relying on hyper-observant players to uncover the story is that the story itself isn't 100% confirmed. Instead, players have to draw their own conclusions about what catastrophe befell the world of Dark Souls based on hints and context clues. Some of those context clues come from visiting places from prior games at different points in the game's timeline. One example is the Darkroot Garden from Dark Souls 1 and Farron Keep from Dark Souls 3, as seen here from this 18-minute-long video explaining the theory. It's fair to assume that if the game loops back to a place you've seen before, it's likely for a good reason. Some popular theories suggest that Bloodborne shares its universe with Dark Souls, the Dark Souls characters travel through space and time, and even that certain bosses aren't in the game, but are merely figments of a character's imagination. Between theories and lore, there's a lot to piece together, and it's no small task. Lucky for you, you won't have to comb through hundreds upon hundreds of item descriptions to unearth the story. Instead, I'm going to attempt to give the shortest, simplest explanation of the game's plot. You play as an undead character who has been brought back from the dead by a curse. Now, this is where there's some variation between the series. In Dark Souls 3, your character is cursed because the Age of Fire ended. As a result, the character's main motivation is to prolong the Age of Fire to stave off the Age of Dark. Dark Souls 2, however, is a bit different. The Age of Fire isn't ending, your character simply wants to find a cure for their curse. Preventing the Age of Dark is a big theme in both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, while Dark Souls 2 touches upon it later in the game. In each game, the player attempts to make a choice about whether or not to continue the Age of Fire/Age of Dark cycle. The cycle will continue if the player chooses to start anew, only to have all of the misery come back eventually with the Age of Dark. Alternately, the player can choose to break the cycle by ushering in the Age of Dark. Think of it as a really sad and depressing version of the Lion King's Circle of Life. As of Dark Souls 3, From Software is done making new Dark Souls games as they feel there's nothing left to explore with the series. But fans don't have to fret, as the success of the Dark Souls series has led to the creation of similar games like Nioh and Salt and Sanctuary, not to mention Bloodborne. Currently, From Software is working on a new series with Miyazaki as the director. We might not know what the next game will be about, but From Software has been able to successfully implement the best features from the previous games. So no matter what the game might be, you should definitely prepare to die. Once again, I'm Jacob with the Leaderboard, and thanks for watching Then vs. Now, Dark Souls 2 vs. Dark Souls 3. Got a favorite build? Have your own theories about the series? Comment below, and don't forget to click the bell icon to become part of our notification squad. And if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the Leaderboard, your home for video game facts.